She was standing at the door of my cab, and she was crying before she even got in. I saw her through the windshield, a woman in her mid-50s, well-dressed, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She was standing on the sidewalk outside Street, Michael's hospital in Toronto, and she was staring at me through the glass with an expression I had never seen on a stranger's face before. Not grief exactly, something closer to shock, like she had seen a ghost. I rolled down the window. I said, "Are you all right?" She pressed her fingers to her mouth and said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Are you Martin Ashford?" I told her my name was not Martin Ashford. I told her my name was Kenneth Ashford, but that my father's name had been Martin. She sat down on the bench beside the taxi stand and she covered her face with both hands and she wept. I did not know what to do. I am 63 years old. I have lived through enough that I am not easily rattled. But I sat there in my cab outside Street, Michael's hospital, on a gray November afternoon, and I watched a woman I had never met in my life cry over my father's name, and I felt something shift quietly inside my chest, like a door unlocking that I hadn't known was there. I want to go back and tell you how I ended up driving a cab at 63, because I think you need to understand that before the rest of this makes any sense. My wife, Carol, died 18 months before that afternoon, pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in March, and she was gone by September. 6 months. That is all we had from the moment the doctor sat us down to the moment I stood in the rain at Prospect Cemetery and watched them lower her into the ground. 6 months to say everything that needed to be said. And still, I left 100 things unsaid. Carol and I had been married for 31 years. We had built our life in Scarborough, in a brick, semi-detached on a quiet street, with a maple tree out front that she had planted herself when we first moved in. After she died, I could not sleep in our bed. I slept on the couch for 4 months. I stopped cooking. I stopped answering the phone. I became, as my oldest son Daniel liked to point out, a problem. I have 2 sons. Daniel is 40, and my younger son, Greg, is 37. I want to be fair to them. I want to believe that grief does strange things to people, and that what they did came from that strangeness. But I am 63 years old, and I have learned that grief is not an explanation for everything. Sometimes people simply show you who they are, and grief is just the occasion. What happened was this. 3 months after Carol died, Daniel came to the house with Greg, and they sat me down at the kitchen table where I had eaten breakfast with their mother for 3 decades. And they explained to me that the house was becoming a burden. They said I was not coping. They said the house was too large for one person. They said they had spoken to a real estate agent, and that in the current Toronto market, the equity in the house could set me up very comfortably in a 1-bedroom condo somewhere manageable. They used the word manageable several times. They had printed documents. They had highlighted sections. They were organized in a way that suggested they had been planning this conversation for longer than they were admitting. I asked them what would happen to the money from the house after I bought the condo. Daniel looked at Greg and then looked back at me and said that there would likely be a significant remainder, and that given everything, given the family, given all that Carol had always wanted for all of them, it seemed reasonable to discuss how that remainder might be shared. Carol had been gone 91 days. I told them I needed time to think. They left. I sat at the kitchen table until the room went dark, and I did not turn on the lights. I did not sell the house. I did not share the remainder. What I did was stop answering their calls, because every call was, and eventually the calls slowed down and then stopped, and I understood that I had been weighed against the money, and I had come up lighter. I started driving for a rideshare company in January. I want to be clear about why. It was not because I needed the income desperately, though the extra money was welcome. It was because I needed to leave the house. I needed to be in motion. I needed to sit in a car moving through the city where Carol and I had spent our whole lives together and feel the streets change around me, and not have to speak if I did not want to, and speak to strangers when the loneliness became too loud. Driving gave me all of that. I had been doing it for about 11 months when I pulled up outside Street Michael's and saw the woman on the sidewalk looking at me like I was her father come back from the dead. Her name was Diane Kowalski. She was 54 years old. She was a civil engineer, she told me eventually, after she had composed herself enough to get into the back seat, and after I had passed her, the small packet of tissues I keep in the center console. She was in Toronto for a conference and had been at the hospital visiting a colleague. She had requested a car through the app, and when she looked up and saw me through the windshield of the cab, she had stopped breathing for a moment. Those were her words. She said she had stopped breathing. I asked her why. She said, "Because for a second I thought you were the man who saved my life." She was 11 years old in the summer of 1981. She was at a family cottage on Georgian Bay, near a small town called Penetanguishene, north of Barrie. It was August. Her parents had gone into town for groceries, and she and her younger brother had been left with their grandmother. The cottage had a wood-burning stove in the kitchen that the grandmother used for cooking even in summer, because that was what she had always done. A grease fire started. The grandmother panicked. The brother was 5 years old and didn't understand what was happening. The fire moved to the curtains and then to the wall. Diane's voice was very steady when she told me this. I could tell she had told it before, or at least that she had lived with it long enough that the telling no longer broke her. What she said was, "A man came in through the kitchen door, not a firefighter, no equipment, no uniform, just a man who had been walking along the road by the waterfront and had seen the smoke through the window. He went into the burning kitchen and he carried her brother out first, because the boy was smaller and closer to the floor. Then he went back in for the grandmother. Then he came back for Diane, who had frozen in the corner of the front room with her arms wrapped around herself. He brought all three of them out to the grass at the edge of the water. He made sure they were breathing. He flagged down a passing car to call 911, because this was 1981, and there were no cell phones, and the nearest phone was down the road. By the time the Penetanguishene Fire Department arrived, the man was gone. Diane's parents came back to find their cottage half destroyed, and their children sitting wrapped in a neighbor's blankets on the lawn. When Diane's father asked who had pulled them out, the neighbor said it had been a young man, who had walked away before anyone got his name. For years, the family tried to find him. Her father wrote letters to the local newspaper. Her mother made inquiries at the town hall. Nobody came forward. The man had walked in off the road, saved 3 lives, and disappeared back into the world as if he had simply been passing through. Diane told me she had grown up with the shape of that man in her mind. She didn't know his face because she had been in shock when he carried her out. She knew the weight of his arms. She knew the sound of his voice, telling her it was all right, that he had her. She had carried that sound for 43 years. When she saw me through the windshield of my cab, she said, "Something in the way I held my shoulders, something in the angle of my profile through the glass, had made her whole body recognize something before her mind could catch up." I told her I didn't know what to say. I told her my father had grown up in Barrie. I told her that in the summer of 1981 he would have been 29 years old. I told her that he had worked summers as a surveyor's assistant all through that part of Ontario, contracting out to different townships, moving around. Georgian Bay would have been the kind of place he passed through. Penetanguishene was exactly the kind of road he would have walked along on a summer morning. I told her I needed to pull over. I found a spot in the hospital's visitor parking lot, and I put the car in park, and I sat there. I thought about my father, Martin Ashford. He had died in 2014 at the age of 62. He had worked his entire life in skilled trades, first as an electrician's apprentice, then as a licensed electrician, then eventually running a small crew for a residential contracting company in Barrie. He had never made a great deal of money. He had lived modestly and died modestly, and left behind very little in the way of material things. What he had left behind was a reputation that I had heard described by every person who had ever worked with him or known him as a man who showed up and did the right thing without needing anyone to notice. He had never once mentioned a fire. He had never once mentioned a cottage on Georgian Bay or 3 people on a lawn or a summer morning when he had walked towards smoke instead of away from it. That was the most him thing I could imagine. Not telling. Just doing it and walking away, and not requiring it to be a story. Diane asked me if I was all right. I said I wasn't sure. She said she had spent a long time trying to figure out what to do with the debt she carried. She said she didn't use that word lightly. Debt. She said that when you are 11 years old, and someone carries you out of a burning building, you understand at some cellular level that the life you live afterward is borrowed. Everything good that happens to you, your career, your children, your ordinary Tuesday mornings, exists because a stranger chose not to keep walking. She said she had thought for years that if she ever found the man, she would simply want to say thank you. Just that. Just those 2 words delivered to the right person. She asked if I thought my father had known what he meant to her family. I said no. I said I was quite certain he had not. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like to do something more than say thank you, if you'll allow it. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling." My first instinct was to say no. Not because I am proud, though I suppose I have my father's tendency toward not needing things to be acknowledged. My first instinct was no because I have a complicated relationship with receiving things from people. Carol used to say I was allergic to being helped. She said it with affection, but she wasn't wrong. My second instinct, the one I had to sit with and examine, was the thought of Daniel and Greg, because I knew that whatever Diane was considering, whatever she wanted to offer, the moment Daniel found out about it, he would appear at my door with more printed documents and more highlighted sections and more careful explanations of what was reasonable and what Carol would have wanted. And I did not want that. I did not want a conversation about my father's legacy to become a negotiation at a kitchen table. So I told Diane the truth. I told her about Carol. I told her about the house and the boys and the kitchen table and the 91 days. I told her I was driving a cab not because I had to, but because I was lonely and the city felt like Carol when I was moving through it. I told her all of it, sitting in a hospital parking lot on a November afternoon, because something about the situation made lying feel like a worse option than it usually does. Diane listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I'm sorry about your wife." Just that. Not "I'm sorry for your loss," which is what people usually say, the phrase worn smooth from use until it means almost nothing. She said, "I'm sorry about your wife," and the specific word wife made it mean something. Then she said, "I don't want to complicate your life. I want to do something that honors what your father did. Whatever form that takes should be your decision, not mine." We talked for another hour in that parking lot. Her conference didn't start until the next morning, and she had no plans for the evening. We walked to a diner on Church Street and sat in a window booth and drank coffee and talked about our fathers and about Barry and about Georgian Bay in August and about the strange geography of a life, the way one small choice on one ordinary morning can spread outward across decades, touching people the chooser will never know. Diane had children, a son, 22, studying mechanical engineering at the University of Waterloo, a daughter, 19, in her first year at Dalhousie. She talked about them the way parents talk about children they are genuinely proud of, without performance, just plain warmth. I thought about what it would have meant to those kids to not exist, because if an 11-year-old girl had died in a cottage fire on Georgian Bay in 1981, they would not exist. My father had never known any of that. He had walked along a road, seen smoke, done what his nature required of him, and walked back into his life. He had driven back to Barrie in his truck and probably eaten dinner and probably not mentioned it. That was who he was. Diane had done well in her career. That was not a secret. She told me plainly that she was a senior partner at an infrastructure firm in Calgary, that she had worked hard and been fortunate, and that she had resources she was grateful for. She said she had thought for years about establishing something in the name of her rescuer, something permanent, if she ever found him. She asked me if there was something my father had cared about, something that would have meant something to him. I thought about it for a long time. I looked out the window at Church Street going dark, at the headlights coming on one by one. My father had done volunteer maintenance work for 20 years at a community center in Barrie's South End. Every Saturday morning. Electrical work mostly, but also plumbing when they needed it. Carpentry when something broke. He never charged them. The center ran programs for low-income families, after-school care, breakfast programs, seniors' activities. It had been struggling for years. I had spoken to one of the staff members at my father's funeral, a woman named Ruth who had run the center for 15 years, and she had cried when she talked about what my father's Saturday mornings had meant to the place. She said that more than once his donated labor had kept a program running that would otherwise have been cut. I told Diane about the center. She nodded slowly. She said, "That sounds exactly right. I am not going to tell you the specific amount of what Diane contributed to the Southdale Community Center in Barrie in my father's name. That feels like it belongs to the gesture rather than the story. What I will tell you is that it was enough to fund their after-school program for several years and to repair the HVAC system that had been failing since 2019. Ruth called me in December, 2 weeks after the donation came through, and she cried again on the phone. She said it felt like Martin was still fixing things. I thought about that for a long time after I hung up. Daniel found out in February. I don't know how, probably through someone in Barrie, because news like that travels. He called me on a Sunday evening, and he was warm in a way that he hadn't been in over a year, and he asked how I was doing, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, and then he said, casually, that he had heard something happened with some donation connected to Dad. I said yes. He said, that's wonderful. And then after a pause, he said, it's interesting that she chose to direct it that way rather than to family. I said I thought it was directed exactly where my father would have wanted it directed. There was a longer pause. He said he just meant that if there was any kind of financial situation arising from Dad's history, it was the kind of thing the family should probably have been part of deciding. I said, Daniel, your grandfather walked into a burning building 43 years ago and saved 3 people and never told a single person. Not your grandmother, not me, not anyone. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And then he spent 20 years fixing the furnace at a community center for free on Saturday mornings because that was also the right thing to do. What happened in December was someone trying to honor that. It had nothing to do with money. It had nothing to do with family politics. It had to do with a man who spent his whole life doing the right thing quietly, and one person finally being able to say thank you in a way that meant something. I don't want to discuss it further. I hung up. I am not going to tell you I felt good about that. I felt sad. I still feel sad. Not angry. Not anymore. Just sad in the way you feel. Sad about something that cannot be repaired, that has been broken for long enough that the edges have gone smooth. Daniel is my son. Whatever he has become, I helped make him. I carry some responsibility for that, and I am still working out exactly how much. But I also felt, underneath the sadness, something that I can only describe as clarity. Diane and I have stayed in touch. She was in Toronto again in March for another meeting, and we had dinner, this time at a proper restaurant, and she brought photographs she had dug out of a box in her mother's house. Photographs from the days after the fire, the cottage with its scorched kitchen wall, her brother squinting into the sun on the lawn. In one of them, blurred at the edge of the frame, there is a figure walking away down the road. A young man. You cannot see his face. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I cannot prove that figure is my father. The quality is too poor, the angle too oblique. But I know the way he held his shoulders. I know that particular combination of being present and already moving on. I have seen it my whole life. I grew up in the shadow of a man who did the right thing and kept walking, and I spent most of that time wishing he had slowed down long enough to tell me what he knew. As it turns out, he told me, anyway, just not in words. In April, I started volunteering on Saturday mornings at the Southdale Community Center. Electrical work, mostly. Some plumbing. A little carpentry when something breaks. Ruth makes coffee, and we talk about my father, and she tells me things about his Saturday mornings that I never knew. Small things, particular things, the kind of details that make a person real in a way that memory alone cannot quite manage. I still drive. Not as much as before, but I still go out some evenings and move through the city and let the streets be carol for a little while. I have not spoken to Daniel since February. Greg sent a short message in March that said, only thinking of you, and I wrote back and said the same. I don't know what will happen with my sons. I have stopped trying to predict it. What I know is this. My father was a man who walked toward smoke. He did it once in a very literal sense, on a summer morning on Georgian Bay, and he did it every Saturday for 20 years, in a quieter way that no one thought to name. He never made a speech about it. He never required an audience. He just showed up and did what needed doing and left the place a little better than he found it. I think about that a lot these days. I think about what it means to leave a place better than you found it. I think about the ways I have failed at that, and the ways I might still succeed. I think about what I want the shape of my remaining years to look like, what I want some stranger someday to remember when they try to describe who I was. I am 63 years old. My wife is gone. My sons are distant. My father never told me the most important thing he ever did, but a woman cried in a hospital parking lot when she saw my face, because for 1 second I looked like the man who had carried her out of a fire 43 years ago. And in that moment, I understood something I should have understood a long time ago. The things we do quietly are not lost. They are just traveling. They find their way home eventually. They always do. Did you enjoy my story? I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from today.